step by step inside a rocket engine during its startup. Now this is a very long video, so here's the timestamps for each section, and we've got the YouTube timeline broken up into those sections too. And if you're more of a reader, we've got you covered with an article version up at everydayastronaut.com with links and sources. That being said, let's get started.
3, 2, 1,
Up front, I need to suggest that you watch my videos, Why Don't Rocket Engines Melt? And in this video. Trust me, don't even try to watch this video without having watched those, because they lay a lot of vital groundwork. And lastly, before we get started, I've got some great news. Our highly detailed 1/100 scale Metal Falcon 9 rocket models are finally back in stock. Get them while you can at everydayastronaut.com/shop. Okay, assuming you have all the basic knowledge of how a liquid-fueled rocket engine works, let's actually start off with the most simple rocket engine to start: a solid rocket motor. By far, the easiest rocket to start has to be a solid rocket motor. Hi, it's me, Tim Dodd, the Everyday Astronaut. Liquid-fueled rocket engines operate by flowing fuel and oxidizer into a combustion chamber at ridiculously high pressures in order to throw as much mass out the flamey end of the rocket as quickly and thereby as efficiently as possible. But how does it get that way? How on Earth, and even more difficultly, how off Earth, do you get an engine up to operating pressures and temperatures? Engines often utilize pumps which themselves rely on the engine to be running in order to get power. And having a rocket engine run and getting a rocket engine running are two... Hi, it's me, Tim Dodd, the Everyday Astronaut. Liquid-fueled rocket engines operate by flowing fuel and oxidizer into a combustion chamber at ridiculously high pressures in order to throw as much mass out the flamey end of the rocket as quickly and thereby as efficiently as possible. But how does it get that way? How on Earth, and even more difficultly, how off Earth, do you get an engine up to operating pressures and temperatures? Engines often utilize pumps which themselves rely on the engine to be running in order to get power. And having a rocket engine run and getting a rocket engine running are two wildly different things. There is often an extremely delicate dance to get the pumps, valves, temperatures, and pressures all up to operating conditions perfectly. Get it wrong by just a few milliseconds even, and you can cause a detonation that can completely destroy the engine. So today we're going to do a deep dive on how exactly you start a rocket engine. We'll cover pretty much everything from a simple solid rocket motor to all of the intricacies of liquid-fueled rocket engines, including thermally conditioning the engine, the spin-up process, the scary transient regions, and the actual ignition of the propellants. Then we'll talk about some of the extra challenges like starting a rocket engine in space, and then we're going to actually go step by step inside a rocket engine during its startup. Now this is a very long video, so here's the timestamps for each section, and we've got the YouTube timeline broken up into those sections too. And if you're more of a reader, we've got you covered with an article version up at everydayastronaut.com with links and sources. That being said, let's get started.
3, 2, 1,
Right up front, I need to suggest that you watch my videos, Why Don't Rocket Engines Melt? And How to Power a Rocket Engine, as those videos will help with a lot of concepts that we talk about in this video. Trust me, don't even try to watch this video without having watched those, because they lay a lot of vital groundwork. And lastly, before we get started, I've got some great news. Our highly detailed 1/100 scale Metal Falcon 9 rocket models are finally back in stock. Get them while you can at everydayastronaut.com/shop. Okay, assuming you have all the basic knowledge of how a liquid-fueled rocket engine works, let's actually start off with the most simple rocket engine to start: a solid rocket motor. By far, the easiest rocket to start has to be a solid rocket motor. In fact, there's actually a good chance that you've done this yourself. If you've ever launched a model rocket or even fireworks, you've already pretty much experienced the ignition sequence of a solid rocket motor. Solid rocket propellant is exactly what it sounds like. It's a solid that is rocket propellant. It's usually like a sludge of premixed fuel and oxidizer, and all it takes is energy to get the combustion process started. In the case of a small model rocket motor, that energy usually comes from the heat from a set of small wires. Bigger solid rocket motors will usually require more energy to get started, so sometimes they'll have some black powder, which is basically gunpowder, that will initially ignite from the wires, and then a chain reaction will occur that will then light the solid propellant, where it will continue to self-sustain. But once you start talking about large orbital class solid rocket boosters like those on the space shuttle, or maybe those on the Space Launch System, otherwise known as the SLS rocket, which is at the heart of the Artemis program, there's basically a bomb sitting on top of the booster that starts the ignition process. There's a device called a NASA Standard Detonator, or an NSD. And this is a little device used since the Gemini program for things like separation events on booster separation and fairings and frangible bolts, or in this case, they're the device that they actually use to start the chain of reactions that'll get these massive solid rocket boosters going. When it's go time, a signal is sent to not just frangible bolt program for things like Standard Detonator, or an NSD. And this is a little device used since the Gemini program for things like separation events on booster separation and fairings and frangible bolts, or in this case, they're the device that they actually use to start the chain of reactions that'll get these massive solid rocket boosters going. When it's go time, a signal is sent to not just one NSD, but a completely redundant NSD to ensure the boosters light. After all, if one doesn't light, it would be very, very bad. And don't forget, once you light a solid rocket booster, there is no shutting it down. The NSDs burst through a thin barrier seal, which then lights a pyrotechnic booster charge. Then that booster charge is what ignites propellant inside an igniter initiator, which then lights the main booster igniter, and that lights the entire surface of the core of the booster virtually simultaneously. So for a little overview here, which then lights the main booster igniter, and that lights the entire surface of the core of the booster virtually simultaneously. So for a little overview here, it's basically a waterfall of explosives that cascade down from the top of the booster until eventually the entire booster is lit, pretty much all at once. Basically stepping up from a small charge to a medium charge to a large charge to booster ignition. Like I said, it's basically more or less a bomb that's lit at the top of the booster, or otherwise known as the forward segment, that starts the ignition process. It's really just about that easy. That's kind of their whole point. They're super simple, and because of their easy ignition process, they're very reliable. But they definitely have limitations, and they aren't nearly as high-performing as a liquid-fueled rocket engine. But it's anywhere near that easy. There's a ton of steps you need to take, but perhaps the first and most important thing to do is to purge the engine and thermally condition it for the extreme environments it's about to encounter. Before you get a liquid-fueled rocket engine running, it has to be prepared for the ludicrous temperatures it's about to face. And believe it or not, I'm not talking about the extreme heat. I'm actually talking about the extreme cold. Not only do most orbital liquid-fueled rocket engines run propellant through the walls of the engine to keep the combustion chamber and nozzle from melting, but the pumps themselves will flow upwards of thousands of liters per second of cryogenic propellants, which can make the metals, valves, and bearings brittle and failure-prone. This, of course, is specifically true of any engine that uses cryogenic propellants. So any liquid oxygen, also known as LOX-powered rocket engine, and especially those that run on hydrogen or hydrolux and methane or methalox for their fuels, which are also cryogenic propellants. These propellants all make up the majority of rocket engines that we see on orbital rockets. But before you even begin to chill down the engine with the propellants, you need to purge the engine from moisture and air pockets, and this is usually done with nitrogen. If there's any water vapor in the lines before cryogens are introduced, it'll freeze and cause damage to the engine with the potential for clogged orifices, damaged seals, clogged injectors, etc., etc. But if it's a hydrolox engine, liquid hydrogen is so cold, it can even turn any residual nitrogen into a solid block of ice and do all of the bad things we just mentioned. And an ice blockage can be really hard to investigate because the evidence of the root cause of the failure melts away by the time a human can even get close enough to investigate. Because of this, hydrogen-powered rocket engines are usually purged with another inert fluid, helium. Helium is the only element that has a lower melting point than hydrogen, so in the presence of liquid hydrogen, it won't freeze solid. Purging and chill down of the engines can be anywhere from a few hours before launch to a few minutes, but this varies very much from engine to engine. So listen for something like engine cooldown or engine chill down called out on comms.
Stage 1 engine chill has started.
Alright, there's that call that Stage 1 engine chill has started.
Okay, so once the engine has been purged of moisture, we can start to actually thermally condition the engine with the cryogenic propellants. This process involves opening what's known as a pre-valve, which is the big valve that connects the engines to the propellant tanks. The propellant will fill the pumps and fill all the way down to the main valves, which is usually one or a number of valves for fuel and oxidizer. Then the pumps will just soak in a bath of cryogenic propellant until the pumps eventually get down to those frigid temperatures. In comparison to cryogenic propellants, the engine is actually scorching hot under normal, everyday human comfortable ambient temperatures. An engine under normal, everyday human comfortable ambient temperatures to be a vent line to remove the boiled off propellants. Oxygen can usually just be dumped overboard, which poses little to no risk when being vented into the atmosphere. But in general, a cryogenic fuel that now has boiled off into a gas like methane or hydrogen needs to be recaptured and either rechilled and pumped back into the rocket, or it can be vented away from the rocket in a controlled manner where a flare can prevent a buildup from accidentally detonating. Because if you just vent gaseous methane or hydrogen out into the atmosphere in an uncontrolled manner, don't expect very good things to happen. This is why you see those giant sparklers lit before Space Shuttle, SLS, or Delta IV Heavy launches. It's not to light the actual engines and start combustion, it's to burn off the gaseous, not giant methane or hydrogen out into the atmosphere in an uncontrolled manner. Don't expect very good things to happen. This is why you see those giant sparklers lit before Space Shuttle, SLS, or Delta IV Heavy launches. It's not to light the actual engines and start combustion, it's to burn off the gaseous hydrogen that will exit the engine during the startup process before main combustion chamber ignition. These are called radial outward firing initiators, or ROFIs. They're just preventing a large cloud of hydrogen from gathering and potentially detonating, which, as you know, could be very, very bad. But the engine isn't chilled down just to protect the engine from the cold temperatures. It's also to protect the propellant from the relatively warm engine, even when it's just resting at ambient temperatures before the engine is running. If the propellant is beginning to boil before it reaches the impellers and the pumps, it can cause cavitation, or basically bubbles in the liquid, and those bubbles can actually chip away at the pumps and completely ruin them. Elon Musk talked about this a little bit when we were talking about the Raptor engine's pumps.
So what you're trying to avoid is cavitation or bubble generation. If you start generating bubbles, the bubbles will actually eat away at your blades. Like, it's weird, like bubbles would chip away metal, but they will.
Really?
And if you cavitate too much, then you're going to just be a bubble generator, and you'll lose pressure. Stop the engine, yeah.
And not only can those bubbles chip away at the pumps, the bubbles can also cause the pumps to overspeed and or starve the engine of the propellant and potentially create stoichiometric conditions, which is the most energetic and highest temperature conditions. And of course, those can be catastrophic. Getting an engine down to operating temperatures is absolutely vital, and it's monitored very closely by the engine's computers that run the engine. In fact, it was a fear that one of the RS-25s wasn't cooling down prior to ignition that caused the first scrub of Artemis 1 on its very first launch attempt in August of 2022.
It's a scrub.
It is officially a scrub?
Officially.
All right.
Launch director called it.
Launch director called a scrub. Engine number 3's temperature sensor wasn't showing the engine had cooled down enough to the required temperatures, so the launch attempt was scrubbed for the day. It turns out the engine was likely indeed at the right temperatures, but the sensor itself was erroneous. But it just goes to show how important engine chill down is. If an engine's not cooling down as expected, no diligent launch conductor would proceed towards liftoff. Some liquid-fueled rocket engines don't use any cryogenic propellants, such as hypergolic propellants. Hypergolic propellants are those that will spontaneously combust when they come in contact with each other. But hypergolics are happy as a clam at room temperature, and because of that, the engines don't really need to be chilled down. In fact, many intercontinental ballistic missiles can sit for years, fueled up and ready to go, and can be fired within a moment's notice. There have been a handful of US-based hypergolic orbital rocket engines, such as the LR-87 used on the Titan II or the AJ-10 on the Delta II's upper stage, but the Soviet Union developed a ton of hypergolic rocket engines. For those of you who have watched my entire history of Soviet rocket engines video may know, the Soviets, well, specific engineering legend Valentin Glushko, loved hypergolic rockets. Just take a quick glance at this family tree that we put together. Any orange or yellow engine near the bottom of the chart is hypergolic. Yeah, that's a lot of hypergolic rocket engines. Some of the more noteworthy ones are the RD-275s on the first stage of the Proton rocket, or the mighty RD-270 that was a full-flow stage combustion cycle engine designed for a massive lunar rocket that sadly never left the drawing board. Okay, so we've chilled our engine down, or we're using hypergolics, so we're already at operating temperatures. But now we need to get the pumps spinning and get them up to operating pressures of potentially hundreds of bar and tens of thousands of RPM. Perhaps the number one rule with rocket engines, and I guess the universe in general, is pressure always wants to flow from high pressure to low pressure. So engines need to have extremely high pressure upstream in order to not send a flame, which would inevitably lead to a catastrophic failure. As you likely know, having a running an engine, the propellant is already stored at high pressure, so it'll naturally flow into the combustion chamber at the necessary operating pressures. But what about an orbital class rocket engine that has turbopumps that spin at absurd speeds? We're talking high power, high chamber pressure engines. Take a look at an open cycle turbopump powered rocket engine while it's running. Notice the fuel pump and the oxidizer pump are connected by a shaft to a turbine that powers them. Turbines can be insanely powerful, with some engines making hundreds of thousands of horsepower from just a simple turbine. So what powers the turbine? Where does that power actually come from? Well, there's usually a preburner or a gas generator of some kind that's kind of like a rocket engine on its own right, and its sole purpose is to produce energy to power the turbine. But take a closer look at the gas generator. It's fed by the pumps. The pumps are powered by the gas generator, but the gas generator is fed by the pumps, but the pumps are powered by the gas. Okay, yeah, you get the point. Okay, here's the second step of starting a liquid pump-fed rocket engine. Spin up. Now there's a handful of ways you can actually get the pumps up to speed, but perhaps the most common is by utilizing a separate high-pressure gas to get the pumps spinning. This can either be supplied with an onboard system, like helium stored in a high-pressure COPV or composite overwrap pressure vessel, or it could be supplied by ground systems, where weight doesn't matter since it doesn't contribute to the overall mass of the rocket. In either case, high-pressure helium or nitrogen is pumped into the gas generator to get the turbine spinning up to operating speeds. For a short period of time, the engine's pumps are being powered by basically a cold gas thruster, which isn't very efficient. A cold gas thruster has a low specific impulse or a low efficiency, and you would want to continue to run the engine off the system any longer than absolutely necessary. But it's simple and reliable, since it's just opening up a valve and letting high-pressure gas flow into the engine, into the preburner or gas generator through the turbines, until the pumps are spinning fast enough to begin combustion. Some engines will use a tiny little rocket motor called a starting cartridge to do pretty much the same thing. It's quite literally kind of a small rocket motor of either solid propellant or hypergolic propellants that act as a gas generator, almost like the cartridge in an airbag whose sole purpose is to generate a lot of gas to quickly inflate an airbag. So for engines that require multiple restarts, such as upper stage engines that might have multiple burns to get to their desired destinations, or even SpaceX's Merlin engine, which has to light up 3 to do that boost back, reentry, and landing burn on a Falcon 9, you have to have enough nitrogen or helium or starting cartridges to get through every single one of those startups. We should probably take a quick little second here and mention the Rutherford on Rocket Lab's Electron rocket. That thing's electric pump fed, and of course we talked about that in my How Do You Power a Rocket Engine video. But now in context of starting, just think about how much easier it would be to start an electrically pump fed engine. You literally just send electricity to pumps and work on the timing, and it's pretty much done from there on. Like, it'd be so easy to tune and figure out the timing when it's all just direct correlated to the speed of a motor. Now, it might be tempting to think you could just use a small electric motor to get these spinning, similar to how a car engine starts. Just get the pump spinning only for a brief moment, and then let the engine run itself. The problem is the power required is insane. We're not just talking about peak RPM, we're talking about horsepower, so RPM and torque, or more specifically, RPM multiplied by torque. In fact, the RS-25's fuel preburner delivers about 200 horsepower per kilogram. Think about that. How big is a 200 horsepower engine or motor? I'm fairly certain that you won't find one that's only 1 kilogram. But there's another way to spin up an engine that doesn't require a separate source to get the pumps up to speed. It's called bootstrapping, or tank head, or sometimes called deadhead starting, and it's where you carefully allow the engine to initially light up using only the tank pressure and the energy in the thermal difference between the propellant and the engine. The RS-25 on the Space Shuttle and SLS do this. At the beginning, the turbine will begin to spin up because the hydrogen flowing through the engine and the walls, the combustion chamber, and the preburner boils off, like we mentioned before. But instead of just having it bleed out and go to the flare stack, during the startup process, we can actually run that high-pressure gas through the preburner into the turbine to begin spinning it. Then there's a very delicate and precise dance to let in some oxygen and light the preburners under low pressures. That weak combustion will slowly gain pressure as the pumps begin to spin up over the next few seconds. As the pumps increase in speed, the pressure rises, which increases the power of increases the speed of the turbine, which increases the speed of the pumps, which increases the pressures. Yeah. It just keeps going. Cusick mentioned that they're looking into trying to bootstrap their Alpha rocket's second stage engine, the Lightning, if at all possible, to remove the nitrogen spin start system from the upper stage.
We do a nitrogen spin start from the ground.
Right.
Although we've recently did a series of tests where we're trying to figure out how low we can go on that spin start.
Before it can bootstrap itself, kind of?
Yeah, before it'll bootstrap itself. So we've definitely been playing with the level of spin start that's required, but we do spin start them. And what we found that we can probably just tickle this thing with a little nitrogen at altitude and get it to run.
Wow.
Much lower, very low spin start requirements. Yeah, the dream would be to deadhead start it, but we haven't gotten that brave yet.
But bootstrapping is definitely a feedback loop that takes very precise control to get up to speed. In fact, bootstrapping is extra difficult because the engine spends a lot of time in what's called a transient, which is the time between being off and up to full power. And this is perhaps one of the most complicated and challenging pieces of this puzzle. Transients are the in-between moments, so in between the engine being stationary and at full power, and vice versa. Or even between throttle settings, the engine is actually in a transient state. But once the engine is running and at a steady state, it's relatively easy to keep running. But why is the transient so hard? Well, remember this whole chicken and egg scenario we had with just getting the pumps up to speed. How do the pumps run if they're powered by a gas generator that itself runs on the pumps? Well, the biggest challenge with the whole startup process is the fact that everything is intertwined, and a change anywhere in the system will immediately have an effect upstream and downstream from the change. So let's say you're trying to bootstrap an engine, such as the RS-25. Like we touched on earlier, the first thing you're going to do after you purge and thermally condition the engine is you're going to introduce some liquid hydrogen into the pumps and the preburner. On its way in, it will flash boil into a gas. That gas expands, and that expanding gas is what's going to start to blow through our turbine and get our pumps spinning up. Stoke Space CEO Andy Lapsa explained this to me when I was standing with him on their test stand with their incredible engine that bootstraps.
The start transient and to some extent also the shutdown transient are some of the highest risk moments in a rocket engine, right? And if you think about it, like our little engine, 1,000 horsepower in the pumps, bigger engines have tens of thousands of horsepower going through the pumps, and they go from 0 to full power in maybe a couple seconds, right? So you've got to control all those horses and make sure they're running in the right direction during that time. So in early development, it is usually one of the higher risk activities for a rocket engine.
Quick little side note, wow, this is honestly one of my favorite conversations, and Andy Lapsa and his company Stoke Aerospace is working on an absolutely incredible rocket. Okay, but that boil-off is spinning up the turbine, which spins the pumps, so now the propellant is starting to flow a little faster. As long as the pressure in the system continues flowing in this direction during this transient region, you're golden. The problem is there's often slight delays between action and reaction. So it's almost like there's waves of pressure changes moving throughout the system. And if those get too extreme, the pressure gradient might actually start to flow backwards. And you can stall out your startup sequence or, even worse, potentially blow up your engine. Take a valve opening, for example. As a valve opens and introduces, say, the oxygen into the preburners, that too will have an effect on the pressure and the flow. And then the preburner ignition will affect the pressure and the flow. It's all just a constant back and forth feedback loop. But now we've touched upon another piece of the puzzle. Ignition. The burner will light under relatively low pressure, but how does it actually light? What starts the ignition process?
พี่แก้เลยนะคะ
แม่เชื่อเหรอหนูต้องขึ้นประกวดแล้ว
เปิดแบรนด์เปิดสวิตช์คาโนซีนและ B12 เชื่อมต่อการทำงาน เมื่อต้องคิดเต็มสปีด
ตัวมัมทำได้อยู่แล้ว
My magic is all working
ดื่มแบรนด์ทุกเช้าเปิดวันเปิดสวิตช์เปิดแบรนด์
ต้นไปอาบน้ำต้น
Just because you combine your fuel and your oxidizer doesn't mean you're going to get combustion. In fact, most propellants, to the dismay of rocket engineers, will kind of happily coexist in the same space and may even exit the system without unleashing their fiery goodness at all. Or even worse, which is often catastrophic. Perhaps you've heard the term hard start. This is basically when the propellants combust at the wrong ratios or perhaps at the wrong time or place. The worst hard starts can severely overpressure the engine or maybe overspin the turbines or cause an energetic detonation that can completely destroy the engine and sometimes even the test stand and or the rocket that they're actually attached to. So the timing and precision of ignition is vital. Like most engines, rocket engines typically require an external source of ignition. Like most engines, rocket engines typically require an external source of ignition to begin the combustion process. But what if we just use propellants that don't need an ignition source at all? Yes, you know, hypergolics. We've already touched on them earlier and in almost every video I've made, but being able to spontaneously combust is one of their biggest advantages. And the fact that they don't need any additional considerations to keep liquid at cryogenic temperature is just really a pure bonus. I mean, don't get me wrong, they're a total pain in the butt in other ways, like being super toxic and carcinogenic. But in the case of ignition and sheer reliability, they're hard to beat. Which is why they're so and the fact that they don't need any additional considerations to keep liquid at cryogenic temperature is just really a pure bonus. I mean, don't get me wrong, they're a total pain in the butt in other ways, like being super toxic and carcinogenic. But in the case of ignition and sheer reliability, they're hard to beat. Which is why they're so common for maneuvering thrusters and on-orbit engines where reliability and long-duration missions matter since they won't boil off. But for LOX-based propellants, if you put your fuel and oxidizer in contact with each other, it likely won't lead to combustion. If you took liquid methane and you poured it into a container of liquid oxygen, don't really expect anything to happen. Even if you swirled it around, without a source of ignition, the two will coexist surprisingly peacefully. Even in gaseous form, this is true for the most part, but as a gas, it's much more likely to ignite with just a small ignition source. So non-hypergolic fuels and oxidizers not only need to be properly mixed for stable combustion, they also need an ignition source to initiate the combustion process in the first place. But once stable combustion has been achieved, and assuming there's adequate and stable flow of your propellants, that initial ignition process is no longer necessary, and it can actually be self-sustaining. The combustion in the chamber acts as a continual source of ignition. Okay, so we've actually got to light up our propellants. Perhaps the simplest option outside of hypergolic propellants is what the Soviet Union decided to do with the R-7 and what Russia still uses today on the Soyuz, which is basically just some giant matchsticks. Yep, literally just some large races with a pair of pyrotechnics that are put inside each combustion chamber and are all lit prior to the propellants arriving in the combustion chamber. Now this is also possible because the gas generator on the RD-107 and RD-108 is basically just a monoprop thruster, so it doesn't need a separate source of ignition. So the main thing you really have to worry about on those engines is actually igniting the main combustion chamber. But it's not very elegant, and it's probably not a great option once you're in space either. So for that, we'll have to look into some other options that are capable of space starts and potentially restarts. Perhaps one of the most common methods is to basically use a spark plug. Okay, maybe not your off-the-shelf spark plug from a Ford Fiesta, but the concept is the same. Take a high electrical voltage and have it jump a gap, which provides the perfect opportunity to ignite the propellant with ionized electrical energy. As you can probably imagine, it does require a good amount of electrical energy to power a rocket engine. To ignite the propellant with ionized electrical energy. As you can probably imagine, it does require a good amount of electrical energy to power a rocket engine-sized spark plug. So rockets using this approach may need to carry heavy batteries or utilize ground support equipment to run current through the igniter at startup. Another method is similar to a spark igniter. Actually, it's again similar to the automobile industry with diesel engines, and that's using a glow plug. Glow plugs also require a lot of electricity to convert to heat, similar to an incandescent light bulb, an electrical heater coil, or a toaster. There needs to be enough heat energy on the surface of the glow plug to initiate combustion of the propellants. And again, once stable combustion has been achieved, the glow plug can just be turned off. It can very precisely focus the beam of energy and tune it to excite the propellant molecules. So it has the potential to be more efficient than other electrically driven devices. Now, it's not very common yet, although Airbus does have some variants of optical ignition for some of their boosters. These methods are all great and commonplace, but they all require massive amounts of electrical power, which is likely stored in big and not so energy-dense batteries. So what if you actually could just use a chemical reaction to start the ignition process? This is actually pretty common and extremely effective. In fact, if you've ever seen a Falcon 9 or Heavy launch, you may have noticed a green flash right at the beginning of ignition. That, my friends, is the injection of a pyrophoric ignition fluid coming in contact with oxygen to begin stable combustion. Pyrophorics are a type of hypergolic. It's a fluid that will spontaneously and virtually instantaneously react with oxygen. So just inject some pyrophoric fluids into the combustion chamber along with oxygen, and ta-da, you've got yourself a flame. SpaceX uses an ignition fluid, and ta-da, you've got yourself a flame. SpaceX uses an ignition fluid called TTEB, or triethyl aluminum triethylborane. It's stored in their own canisters on board the rocket and allows for multiple restarts of their Merlin engines. Now, not every engine is connected to a TTEB canister, only the engines that would do a relight. So 3 of the 9 Merlin engines on the booster and the vacuum Merlin engine on the upper stage. But on the ground, the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy are lit using ground-supplied TTEB, because why not keep those systems and their weight on the ground if you don't need to carry that mass off the launch pad? Now, SpaceX has taken a little bit of a hybrid approach to ignition with their new Raptor engine. The Raptor engine uses what are called torch igniters. Torch igniters are basically just a fancy version of the lighters that you might use to light a candle. You may or may not hear them called ASIs, or augmented spark igniters. The ASI has its own little small spark ignition and then its own supply of methalox that allows for the torch to burn. So it in itself is almost like a little flamethrower that's initially lit with a spark ignition. Then that torch remains lit through the rest of the startup sequence. So it's kind of like the cascading effect of the solid rocket booster ignition. This uses a smaller electrical ignition source to ignite a small baby flamethrower. But surprisingly, this is only done on the pre-burners because, believe it or not, the Raptor engine has no igniters in the main combustion chamber.
So you got torch igniters for the main chamber, but Raptor 2 has no torch igniters in the main chamber. So you can see it's much cleaner around the chamber area.
How's it light then?
Well, that's a secret sauce.
Although Elon was tight-lipped about how exactly they get away with ignition in the main combustion chamber, it's actually assumed that SpaceX is getting away with homogeneous combustion, or basically spontaneous combustion when the methane and oxygen come in contact with each other. But the main reason that they can get away with that is because in the Raptor's full flow stage combustion cycle, both the fuel and the oxidizer are pre-burned in their own pre-burners, and then they arrive in the main combustion chamber as hot gases already. So take the fact that it's a gas-gas interaction, along with ridiculously high pressures seen in the combustion chamber, no ignition source is necessary. The propellant is already plenty hot and bothered and ready to burn. Well, I think that pretty much covers all the major parts of starting a rocket engine. But before we get into some examples, let's actually cover one more challenge: starting a rocket engine in space. Starting a rocket engine on the ground is pretty challenging, but at least it has a few things going its way. First off, the rocket can utilize a lot of ground support equipment for startup. This means the rocket doesn't need to provide crazy amounts of high-pressure starting propellant, electricity, ignition fluid, or whatever else you may need. And best of all, gravity is pulling down on the rocket and the propellant held inside. So the more dense liquid propellant will sit at the bottom of the tanks, while only at the very top of the tank, opposite of the feed tubes, will have gases. But the same thing isn't true when trying to light an engine in space. Well, not just specifically in space, but more when you're not accelerating or not on the ground. Because when not accelerating, everything is in the same inertial reference frame. In other words, when the engines are off and the spacecraft is just floating in space, there is no acceleration, meaning the propellant is more or less just a blob floating around in a tank. So in order to start a rocket engine in space, we first need to make sure the liquid propellant is at the bottom of the tank so the pumps, engine, and or the thrusters can suck up the liquid as intended and not get gas bubbles, which can be really bad. A common method for doing this is by using what's known as ullage thrusters. This is where you either use a small solid rocket motor or cold gas thruster to settle the propellants.